Hey folks, welcome back to History Chat at 1 o'clock on Thursdays, and where we are now doing the history of the Republican Party. And today we are at the rise of Reagan, which is, I don't know, kind of important. Anyway, I left you last week with the idea of movement conservatism coming out of World War II and out of the construction of the New Deal by the Democrats and by Eisenhower's acceptance of that and really expansion of it, or adjustment of is maybe a better word, with his middle way, and how that moment in history where Americans rallied around the idea of a liberal consensus, meaning that whether you were a Republican or a Democrat, you agreed that the government had a role to play in regulating business, providing a basic social safety net, and promoting infrastructure. That liberal consensus was widely shared, and it helped to usher in this era of enormous prosperity. But that a group of people who opposed government regulation, primarily quite wealthy people who opposed the idea that government should have anything to say about the way they ran their businesses, hated this new liberal consensus and in fact wanted to push back on it, and tried to do so in the 1950s by arguing that this was simply not part of God's plan, if you will, to have a government deciding how men should act. But they really didn't get any traction until the passage of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Not the passage, I'm sorry, the Supreme Court decision of Brown v. Board of Ed in 1954, in which the Supreme Court unanimously decided that it was segregation was unconstitutional, and that public schools had to be desegregated with all deliberate speed, as they said. And when that happened, movement conservatives could reach back to the American history of during Reconstruction and say that any attempt to level the playing field between African Americans and Euro Americans would cost tax dollars and would create, therefore, a situation where you had a redistribution of wealth from hardworking white taxpayers to people that they considered lazy African Americans. And that setup from the 1870s in America had traction, especially in the American South and West, where new populations had expanded during World War II. And that convinced it really started to give movement conservatism traction. And I talked about how you had the rise, for example, of the John Birch Society that was against the idea of communism. The idea behind that was that it was organized around this character, John Birch, who theoretically had been set up by the U.S. State Department when he spoke out against communism in China. He was, in the novel, he was a missionary in China. And you had these different organizations standing against both communism and the idea of any kind of domestic attempts to redress historic conditions of inequality. So you get the marriage, if you will, of civil rights and communism, harking back to Reconstruction, but really gaining teeth after World War II during the Cold War. It's a funny sleight of hand to be out there in California, for example, which is getting so much tax money to fight the Cold War, and to say we're against the idea of using federal government to level the playing field because we're anti-communist, at the same time that they are functioning based on the idea they're taking federal tax dollars. It's kind of to my mind, it's very hard to wrap your mind around what seemed to me to be very contradictory ideas, and yet they did, and they held them together. So that's where I left you last week, and where I want to pick that up is what happened after 1964, and when Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater lost the election of 1964, what that meant and what that looked like. Because when Goldwater loses that election in a debacle, he only carries his home state of Arizona and 5 deep southern states. It really looks like movement conservatism is done. If you remember that election, which many of you probably won't, you will remember that Goldwater was buried with so deeply in that election that people really thought that his ideas and movement conservatism were done and over. So, for example, there's actually a history of the Republican Party written about that time that doesn't even mention these guys. It's basically like, like there's some flash in the pan group that doesn't we'll never hear from again. And the reality is they came to take over the Republican Party within about 20 years. So to me, what's really interesting is how they did that. This is the crucial decade between 1819. I'm sorry, I can keep saying that today. I mean the 19s, of course, between about 1964 and about 1984. And how that happened is key to where we are today. So I'm going to break that down for you. And I'm a little frustrated because, realistically, you could spend your entire life on just this topic, and I'm not going to do it credit because I'm going to try and do it exactly in an hour. So you're not going to get stuff like the actual development of the Iran-Contra affair or the war in Grenada or all the things that I'd like to talk about and really can't, just because of the time. All right, so let me tell you where we are. When I left you with the idea of Ronald Reagan, who at the time is from California and a B-list actor whose time is sort of gone. And I don't mean as in he's not there anymore, but rather that his sort of clean-cut looks were not as effective by the 1960s when you have the rise of the counterculture as they were perhaps in the 1950s. So he's kind of a little bit washed up. And he has become a spokesperson for corporate interests on a television show, and he goes on TV to endorse Barry Goldwater in a very famous speech called "A Time for Choosing," and you have seen perhaps the Lincoln Project picking that up in some of their ads, saying it is a time for choosing, and they're doing that deliberately because they're trying to hark back to what put Ronald Reagan on the national political scene. And he gives this speech in which he really is sort of vintage Reagan. He tells folksy stories, he ignores statistics, he takes pot shots at educated people, pot shot at Harvard in that speech. And he basically says that what the Democrats are trying to do is they're trying to put us on what he calls the ant heap of totalitarianism. He is pushing back against the liberal consensus, against the idea of government regulation, against the idea of a basic social safety net, and against the idea of public investment in infrastructure, because he is pushing back against the whole New Deal and middle way era. And of course, Goldwater still goes down in flames, but that really marks the rise of Reagan as a national figure, that speech, A Time for Choosing. You can see that, by the way, on YouTube if you're interested. It's very interestingly lit, among other things. But anyway, so we're done, right? Goldwater's done, Reagan's done because he endorsed him, and everything's over as of 1964. Well, obviously not. And what happens is the movement conservatives take something really, really important from two really important things from the Goldwater candidacy. The first is that when a number of moneyed interests decided they couldn't back Goldwater and instead backed Kennedy, what the Goldwater people did is they started new forms of fundraising. And they went to a direct mail fundraising campaign. So they really kind of pulled politics out of the growing power of Eastern elites, if you will, and crowdsourced funding. And they did so through a direct mail campaign. And what this does is and they continue that campaign after they lose the election. And what that does is it gives power to the places like the John Birch coffee klatches and to people who are not necessarily being listened to or having influence in the general federal circles, but they're getting traction and they're getting power and they're sharing language at the local level, primarily in the South and the West. And this should sound really familiar. So that's one thing that happens. And those organizations start to form their own conservative, they call them, organizations. And by that, I want to emphasize this is not traditional Burkean conservatism. It's movement conservatism. And the goal of movement conservatism is to undo the New Deal. That's very different than what Burkean conservatives are trying to do. This is really kind of a radical form, if you will. All right, so yes, Gary, that's exactly the name that I was going to mention, and I don't know how to pronounce it. Richard Vigueri, is that it? Anyway, the other thing that happens that's really important about this, about Goldwater, is that he has peeled 5 deep Southern states away from the Democrats. So the the Deep South has stayed Democratic from at least 1876 forward. And there's been a couple of cracks. In 1920, Tennessee votes for Republicans. But for the most part, it's been called the Solid South for a reason. It is solidly Democratic. And nobody has broken into it until Goldwater does. And Goldwater takes 5 deep Southern states. And when he takes those 5 deep Southern states, that's a light bulb moment for the Republicans. In this moment when they have been facing the Democratic hegemony, if you will, over American politics since 1932. So they're recognizing that there's a major crack there. And Goldwater, of course, broke into those southern states by saying he thought desegregation was unconstitutional. Part of the whole argument of the movement conservatives, especially as it's fleshed out in National Review. All right, so there's that. And then there's also something really interesting that happens. The other thing that happens is when Goldwater crashes and burns, what that does is it gives the Democrats a supermajority in Congress. And with that supermajority, they do a number of things. So, for example, they pass all kinds of new Great Society legislation, designed, as LBJ said, to go to war on poverty. It's part of their war on poverty. But what happens with that is that there are very few occasions when a party has a supermajority in Congress. And often what that means is that the people who are not part of that supermajority feel underrepresented. They feel like they're not getting enough say in Congress. And that's pretty much what happens here. When the Congress passes, for example, civil rights legislation and the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s, mid-1960s, which again, in retrospect, is huge and important. At the time, the coincidence of the passage of that act and the rise of rioting in inner cities convinces a lot of people who might not otherwise have listened to the movement conservatives that they're right. That in fact, the tax dollars that are behind things like civil rights legislation and the programs behind civil rights legislation are simply handing hardworking white the tax dollars of hardworking white people to people who are rioting in the cities. And the reason that the riots break out in the cities is because the conditions of inner cities after World War II really deteriorate as white people and white businesses flee the cities into the new suburbs, and they take the tax base with them. So what that means is that cities where people of color are left behind lose their tax bases and become economically depressed. And when that happens, it's a lovely thought to think that voting is simply going to answer everything, but it's not. It's not going to answer the problems of economic depression. And when that happens, this coincidence of this measure of voting that matters so terribly much, with the idea that voting really is not going to solve the problems of economic flight, that doesn't play well politically among white voters who suddenly are more willing to listen to the movement conservative arguments. So what happens is that in the 1966 midterm elections, the Republicans actually make great gains, and they begin to slow down the idea of LBJ's Great Society and of the idea that the federal government should, in fact, work to create a social safety net primarily, because this to them seems to be, I'm sorry, I forgot to turn my phone off, seems to be an example of white tax dollars helping African-American populations. So there is that going on in that moment. There is, and again, I'm talking here about the Republican Party. There are, of course, other things going on that are behind the riots. Things like the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the change in the movements, all sorts of other things. But today, I'm only talking about the way the Republican Party movement conservatism takes over the party. So I'm going to be playing short shrift to the larger development here. I'm trying to give you a perspective of what it looked like from the position of movement conservatives and voters who are going to switch from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party over the next 45 minutes. All right. So all right. What happens in 68? So I've got you, that's 64, now 68. Now, again, I'm really not going to give you everything that's happening in 68 when you are going to get assassinations and Vietnam and all kinds of that going on as well. But what's happening politically in 68 is for the Republican Party is who should be the nominee in 68. The logical choice is Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president, but he is already known as Tricky Dicky. A lot of people don't trust him. And movement conservatives totally don't trust him because he has been Eisenhower's vice president. And movement conservatives who do now command those 5 deep southern states or have the potential to command those deep southern states don't trust him. So in 68, they begin to mount a counter movement to get Ronald Reagan on the Republican ticket as a movement conservative. And this is going to force the hand of Richard Nixon, who Richard Nixon is a fascinating character. Really a fascinating character. And I don't want to say tragically flawed because tragic sort of implies that it's sad. I mean, he's a loathsome character in so many ways, but mentally he's really, really interesting because he's kind of straddling a number of worlds. And I won't be able to do him justice. I urge you to read maybe Rick Perlstein's book on him or his own memoirs. He's constantly self-serving. I'll tell you more about Nixon. Well, maybe I'll tell you about him now. We now know, it came out a few years ago, that he beat his wife so badly he put her in the hospital. And reporters knew about it, but then domestic violence was considered a private matter. Obviously, he's an abusive man. He's also a smart man. He's just a funny, kind of a grab bag of characteristics. In any case, Nixon knows that if he's going to sell up the nomination for himself, he's got to undercut Reagan. So what does he do? He literally goes and courts Strom Thurmond, who was the leader of the Dixiecrats, who switched from the Democratic Party into the Republican Party in order to vote for Barry Goldwater. And he courts Strom Thurmond and he says, listen, if you will continue to support me, a Republican, I will promise you that I am not going to use the federal government to press desegregation. And that is what we now know as the Southern strategy. And you will hear sometimes in, as I say, the fever swamps of the internet that there was no such thing as a Southern strategy. That's ridiculous. Of course there was. And if you're interested, you can Google Lee Atwater's statement about that. I'm not even going to tell you where it is because it's vile. He uses language that is over the top, even for over the top language about what they were doing. And he basically says, we're using race whistles, and I'm putting that very genteelly. That's not the language he uses. Because you can no longer do things like go out in public and use the N-word, but we're basically saying the same thing just in a different way. And if you don't believe in Lee Atwater, you don't want to look at Lee Atwater, which with good reason, mind you. Lee Atwater, by the way, was one of the political operatives who comes up with Paul Manafort and Roger Stone. He died a long time ago of cancer, but if you're interested in this, there's also a wonderful, boring, but if you're interested in politics, book by a guy named Kevin Phillips that's published in 1969, and it's actually dedicated to Nixon. And he says Nixon's the guy who really figured out that we can nail together this coalition of anti-desegregation people, traditional Catholics, and Republicans to, movement conservative Republicans to dominate politics in the, forever in the future. And that book is recently reprinted. It was out of print for a long time. If you're interested in it, I would only read the introduction, which you maybe can find on Google Books. The actual way he breaks it down is probably more than most people want to read, but he does break down in the introduction exactly what the Southern strategy is. And in the dedication to Nixon, where he says he's the dude who figured all this out. All right. So Nixon actually goes and courts the Dixiecrats and basically says that he will back off of the liberal consensus, back off of the idea of protecting civil rights, so long as it will bring those old recalcitrant Southern Democrats to the Republican Party. And everyone always says, when did the party switch sides? This is when the parties switched sides. Now, there's a longer history of this, of course, that I'm not going to go into today, but this is the magical moment between 1963, before when you're going to get in the early 60s, you're going to get JFK and Robert Kennedy having the Democrats enforce desegregation. You get the switch here in 63 to 64 when the Dixiecrats join the Republican Party. Then you've got the Goldwater people looking like they've got egg on their faces and it's not going anywhere. But Nixon then picks it up and engages in what's known as the Southern strategy to say, hey, we Republicans are willing to make a coalition with you Dixiecrats in order to get in power and to break the back of the New Deal Democrats. That's the moment right now. So lots of people write to me and say, what do I say to my great aunt Tilly when she says this is ridiculous that the sides switched? Or what do I say to my great uncle Festus when he says it's the Democrats who backed the KKK? The answer is right here between 1963 and 1980, but give me 1969 if you want to. And I'm gonna play the rest of that through for the rest of today. All right. So what happens is that Nixon also has another problem, and he recognizes that there's all sorts of coalitions going on here, and there's a longer story behind that someday I hope to write. But he also recognizes that even though he's going to court people like Strom Thurmond, he's going to lose a lot of real white white racists in the South. So he's got to find more people for his coalition. And what he decides to do is he's going to turn to urban Democrats in the North to convince them that they're facing law and order issues, that they're facing rioting in their cities that is characterized in Nixon's terms by minorities. So he's going to really focus on law and order, and he's going to try and bring those people into his coalition as well. And so you can see things like this, if you will, it's a little bit later, in Archie Bunker. A great example there of a place where Archie Bunker is, in All in the Family, and Norman Lear's All in the Family, that sitcom, where he's somebody who is pick-upable, if you will, by the Republican Party. And that's something that Lear picks up so effectively when he puts All in the Family on TV beginning in, I believe it's 1971. I think it's going to run from 1971 to 1979. Anyway, so Nixon then goes ahead and creates a campaign based on what he calls the Forgotten Man. And this is a really interesting or the silent majority. And this is a really interesting trope because it actually comes, again, from the Reconstruction years. And what he's arguing is that he is speaking for what he's going to call the silent majority, hardworking white men, and this is what he is characterizing them as, although for a bit he's going to talk about women. That's going to change in 1970. And he says, you know, we're the hardworking regular guys here, and we are having our tax dollars taken from the government to help out special interests, people who want a handout. And they're you know, we're the, if you will, the Archie Bunkers who show up and we just want to do our jobs and take care of our wives and daughters, and that the federal government is stealing that money from us through taxes and giving it to these people who are rioting in the streets. And in order to sell that idea, Nixon's handlers turn really effectively to television. So as I said before, Eisenhower is the first really to effectively use television in his 1952 campaign. And again, the difference between the TV production of the campaign, of the convention, the 52 convention, which is honest to God like watching paint dry. It's like a whole bunch of men standing around in shirts and pants. If you then look at the clips of Eisenhower's campaign rallies, it's like, I don't know, it's like that moment in The Wizard of Oz when it goes from black and white to being in color. It's like all of a sudden you go from guys standing around to ticker tape and cars and celebrities. Eisenhower does that. In 68, Nixon's people also handle him. They also try and package him. And they do so really deliberately. One Nixon media advisor said, you know, voters are basically lazy. Reason requires a high degree of discipline, of concentration. Impression is easier. Reason pushes the viewer back. It assaults him. It demands that he agree or disagree. Impression can envelop him, invite him in, without making an intellectual demand. When we argue with him, we seek to engage his intellect. The emotions are more easily roused, closer to the surface. more malleable. And so what his handlers do is they start to produce television commercials, which you can watch on YouTube, by the way. And I got mesmerized by them one night and, I don't know, lost hours of my life because I watched so many of them. And what they are is essentially almost a Ken Burns version of the world. They show photograph after photograph after photograph of chaos and confusion and anger and hate and all the crap that's going on in the 1960s. And then there'll be this image of like the Statue of Liberty or something, you know, very patriotic. And then this voice that says, Richard Nixon, vote as if your whole world depends on it. I mean, it just makes him look like the solution to all this chaos, even though he's not producing any kind of policy decisions or anything. He's just saying, vote for me. I'll take care of it. You know, I've got a plan for Vietnam, you know, but I'm not going to tell you till after the election. And you can see, obviously, Trump trying this now, but it's much easier to do if you're not an incumbent, which, of course, Nixon isn't in 68. The other thing that Nixon's handlers do is they give movement conservatism this kind of visual language. And very deliberately, they package Nixon in what are called town halls at the time in front of the television. And they pick the people who are going to be asking questions. They keep the press from showing up. They very carefully construct the answers. They do Nixon's clothes and his makeup. And they're very staged events that are supposed to look like town halls, but they are actually media. I mean, they're actually sort of like half-hour commercials, if you will. And guess who organizes those? This new, young, up-and-coming visual medium worker, if you will, named Roger Ailes. This is where Roger Ailes, who is going to go on to develop the Fox News channel, gets his start. Hand-picking and hand-creating this visual imagery that's not real, but that is very, very powerful. Here's a quote actually from Ailes about this. What's interesting is there's actually somebody who's associated with the campaign who gets great quotations about the 68 campaign. And he said of Nixon, I'm sorry about the language, which I'm not sure I can say on, I don't know if I can say it on YouTube, so I guess I won't use the expletive. You can figure out what the word is when I say it. He says, quote, let's face it, a lot of people think Nixon is dull. They think he's a bore. They think he's a pain in the expletive. But television, carefully managed, can make them forget all this. And that's exactly what he did. Is he took, he turned the sort of boring politicians, which is a profession after all, into rock stars, and sort of stripped away the substance of policy and stripped away the ideas behind politics and replaced them with images that appeal to the emotions. And this 68 campaign is really when that happens. And you can see LBJ had flirted with it in 64 with the Daisy ad, but it's really the 68 Nixon campaign that really does that. All right, so Nixon's campaign, of course, is going to benefit immeasurably from the absolute chaos in the Democrats in that year, which is itself a fascinating story that I don't have a really fascinating story. I'm obsessed right now with the Democrats, but maybe we'll do a show on the Democrats at some point. But the Democrats, of course, are imploding themselves with the 68 convention, and we've got the terrible assassinations of that year, tragic assassinations of that year, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., of course, and then later on Robert Kennedy. And people are anxious and they're frightened, and Nixon, with his intoning of, I can take care of this, and his association with Eisenhower, with a more stable time, actually manages to win the election. Even though, and I emphasized this on Tuesday, even though he wins the election, more Americans vote for somebody other than him than vote for him. And he's going to be very aware of that, and that's going to matter in 1972. All right, I'm spending probably too much time on Nixon. I do find him in many ways one of our more interesting politicians. That's not to say I endorse Nixon by any stretch of the imagination, but I find him a really interesting psychological study in a way that Benjamin Harrison isn't, or even Ronald Reagan isn't. Really, Ronald Reagan isn't. Anyway, I'll get to Reagan. All right, so Nixon tries to both stand in the middle now. He's got all these different groups to be happy, and to keep movement conservatives happy, and he's not going to be able to do it. But his first 2 years, he's like giving with one hand and taking away with another. So he's really interesting. If you look, for example, at his fiscal policy, which I don't expect anybody to do, he like giveth with one hand and he taketh away with the other. And reading through his fiscal statements is just really interesting, because they're like, I'm trying to help you guys, but oh crap, that's going to create inflation. I'm pulling this back, and now I'm going to help you guys. Oh crap, that's going to create unemployment. I'm pulling that back, and I'm going to do this. And it makes for a really interesting study of actual governmental policies. But he ends up first with a recession, and then with what looks to be an economic boom. And he tries, as I say, to play both sides. The traditional Republicans and Democrats who are interested in the liberal consensus spending on the one hand, and with leveling the economic playing field in America on the one hand, and with movement conservatives on the other. So, for example, he signs the Clean Air Act of 1970, but then he turns to business to go ahead and figure out how to implement the regulations that he's put in place. He pours money into the arts, but then he actually gives the control of that money to new, more conservative organizations. So he's kind of both sides, which is one of the things that makes him, to my mind, so interesting. But then Nixon's going to get into huge trouble in 1970. In 1970, remember, Nixon had been elected on the idea that he was going to find peace in Vietnam. He was going to create peace in Vietnam. Now, we now know he manages to undermine LBJ's peace talks before the 1968 election. And it's interesting because I'd always heard rumors of that. And as you probably know, I'm quite a skeptic. And I always thought that was kind of tinfoil hat stuff. Like, oh, come on, Nixon was bad, but nobody would really do that. I was wrong. We now have proof that he did, in fact, do that, which I find mind-boggling. But you can see why he's going to be so hideously paranoid in about a year, 1971. Anyway, in 1979, he's promised that there's going to be a solution. He can't find a solution. And when he gets frustrated about the fact he can't do it, Americans begin to bomb North Vietnamese supply bases across the border in Cambodia and Laos. And when the news of these bombings comes out, Americans are horrified. Like they really thought we were going to get peace with honor in Vietnam because the president said so. And Americans are not accustomed at that point to presidents lying to them. And in fact, it's a really big deal when it turns out that Eisenhower has lied to the American people and said during the U-2 incident, and said that in fact, the U-2 plane that is shot down over the USSR is not a surveillance plane. It comes out that he's lied. And when that happens, Americans are like, whoa, the president's not supposed to lie to us. And it's a really big deal. They haven't wrapped their head around the idea that the president could actually go look them in the eye and lie. And it's going to be Nixon who really establishes that. And this is one of the reasons that Nixon's presidency is seen as a real sea change in American politics, because Americans go from being, yes, my president, to we don't trust that guy. We don't trust Tricky Dicky. Anyway, so when Americans discover that rather than winding down, the Vietnam War is ramping up, they get really disillusioned in a hurry, and you're going to get a whole bunch of new protests against the Vietnam War in the streets in early 1970, in April and May of 1970. And of course, this is going to lead to the shooting at Kent State on May 4th of 1970, when National Guard troops fire on college protesters. It's a very complicated event, by the way. I'm not going to do it justice, but they fire on the students, and 4 college students are killed at Kent State. And when that happens, not only does Neil Young write 4 Dead in Ohio, but ordinary middle-class Americans look at the fact that their kids, and they associate their kids with this kind of middle-class education, have actually been shot and killed by U.S. troops. And that is a huge change in terms of Nixon's popularity. Now, there were ways he could have handled that, but what he does is he goes out and he blames the students, and he basically says they're thugs. Now, I'm paraphrasing, he doesn't say that precisely, but he gives the impression that it's the students' fault that they have been killed. One of his press secretary actually said, when dissent turns to violence, it invites tragedy, implying that the protesters at Kent State were violent when they actually were not. And when this happens, the expletive hits the fan. People who had been willing to go along with Nixon turn against him in a hurry. Now, here's a piece of sort of not really trivia, but kind of, is that that's actually the weekend that the monument at Stone Mountain is being dedicated. And Nixon was supposed to be there. People think that that whole monument thing is from the 19th century. It is not. It was dedicated in 1970, and Spiro Agnew goes down and dedicates it. But that just illustrates the relationship here between the rise of movement conservatism and racism, the embrace of this Confederate idea that African Americans should not have rights. And this is actually the same weekend as the dedication of Stone Mountain. All right, so what happens then is that Nixon increasingly is pleading for Americans to stay behind him. In 1969, he had given that famous silent majority speech saying, yeah, I know people are upset about Vietnam. They're protesting in the street, but they're a vocal minority. The silent majority is with me. In 69, that it's only about Vietnam. After Kent State, he expands that to say that anybody who is with me is the good guys. We're the silent majority. And anybody protesting anything is part of this vocal minority. And you see this dramatically in January of 1970, when Time magazine, which is on the conservative spectrum, actually makes as its person of the year, its people of the year, the middle Americans. And those middle Americans are the ones I identified before, people who are Goldwater supporters and who are white and who believe that their tax dollars are being taken away from them to give to special interests, especially people of color, and they're not being thanked for it. They're being denigrated. They're not being they're being considered square, and they're not getting the attention that they should. Now, after this event at Kent State, before the election of 1970, the midterm elections, with Pat Buchanan, Nixon is going to make a real push to bring Catholic Democrats on board by hitting the abortion issue. And when they do that, they're going to include in their special interest groups women who are asking for equal rights. So that's actually the magical moment when women join the bad guys, if you will, in the movement conservative lexicon. It's been there, but this really happens in 1970. All right. So then what happens is that increasingly Nixon tries to cement his power by focusing on the idea of us versus them. And they really carefully, the Nixon people really carefully use that language to say either you're with me or you're with them. And he uses this language a lot. They say that it's better not to work than it is to work. They say. There is no they. That's a rhetorical device to say those people are doing X. And this is, again, where it all starts. You know, I'm looking at the time. I might not make it to Reagan, and I hope that's okay with you guys. I would like to make it to Reagan, but I'm like, this stuff is so important, and it's so, to me, interesting. We'll see. Anyway, if I cheat you out of Reagan, I promise I'll pick him up next week because he's kind of important too. All right, so increasingly Nixon harps on this idea of us good guys versus those bad guys. And it's worth pointing out here that his stance of this individualist, hardworking American, his movement conservative rhetorical stance, if you will, is what enables him to go and create détente with China. It's the thing that lets him reach out to China, because if any Democrat had done that, they would have been like, you know, you're a communist, you're whatever. But because he has such bona fides as a communist warrior, as an American individualist, he and his national security person, Henry Kissinger, are able to exploit what is right then a tension between Russia and China to reach out to China, which is going to put more pressure on Russia. And if you do want to read anything on this period, Kissinger's description of this moment in world history in his memoirs is some of the most interesting reading I've ever done on this period. And Nixon talks about it too, but Kissinger's version of what they are doing by reaching out to China is absolutely fascinating. You know, when I was reading about it, I ended up, it's not really my period, and certainly foreign affairs is not my thing, but I was reading about it and I'm like calling up all these maps and tracing through who's fighting where on the Russia-China border. And it was actually really mesmerizing, and it's not long. In my memory, it's only a paragraph. I'm sure it was pages, but it was interesting enough that I thought it was shorter than it was. All right, so by 72, of course, we get Nixon reaching out to China and coming up with a new modus operandi with China, and that itself is an incredibly interesting story. If anybody is interested in that, there is, I run a history magazine as well, and we have a wonderful woman named Sarah Mergel who writes for us about Nixon, and she has an entire article on what was called ping pong diplomacy. If anybody's interested, it's at Weir History, and her name is Sarah Mergel. The article's on ping pong diplomacy, and just absolutely fascinating stuff. Okay, I'm going to drop China now, and you're not going to hear about China again from me, I don't think, at all, at least in this series. All right, so what happens? I don't think I'm going to make it to Reagan. I'm sorry. I've only got 15 minutes left, and we haven't done Watergate. Well, we'll see. All right, so Nixon's good, right? He's reached out to China. He's got, this rhetoric going on. This should be a cakewalk, the 72 election, right? It's a no-brainer. It is a no-brainer, except it's not. And this is one of the reasons that I find him so fascinating. He doesn't see it as a no-brainer. Now, as I say, we now know that he has this skeleton in his closet, that he has scuttled the Vietnam peace talks that LBJ had engaged in before the 1968 election. So he's got that going on in his head, and he knows if that's exposed, that not only is he going to lose in 72, he could very well go to jail. That's a big deal, and I think a really important deal that I may or may not expand on. All right. So what happens is that 72 looks great for Nixon, but it's interesting because that's not what happens. So what happens is this: in 1971, the New York Times begins to publish what are called the Pentagon Papers, and the Pentagon Papers are these. It's a secret study that was done by the Pentagon, no brainer there, right? In looking at what had happened in Vietnam. And what the Pentagon Papers said was that that American presidents, not including Nixon, it did not go as far as Nixon, American presidents had lied to the American people about what was going on in Vietnam. And one of the guys who had been involved with this was a guy named Daniel Ellsberg. And Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. And there was a lawsuit about whether or not the New York Times could publish those. And that's been in the news again and again. And every time the current president, Donald Trump, tries to stop something secret from being published, they go back to the Supreme Court case that said that, in fact, the public interest in these secret papers overrode the nation's secret rules for secrecy. And so, I mean, the issue is there. You have to prove that it's really important. You can't just throw crap on the internet, or I'm sorry, in those days in a newspaper, because it's secret and it's going to embarrass somebody. There has to be an overriding public interest, which with the Pentagon Papers there was. Now, as I say, Nixon's not included in those Pentagon Papers. They don't go up as far as his administration, but he goes ballistic over them. Now we know why. He's terrified. They are going to go forward, and they're going to find out what he did with LBJ's peace talks. But he goes to the FBI and he says, you got to find these leakers. There are people who are out to get me. They're out to destroy my Vietnam policy. And the FBI is like, dude, and I paraphrase here, dude, you're nuts. There's not some concerted thing going on here. And he can't let it go. And he's determined to stop leaks. And when the FBI won't do it for him, he puts together a special investigations unit to stop leaks. Well, who do you call to stop leaks? Plumbers. These are the plumbers, as they were known. They were designed to stop the leaks about what was happening in Vietnam. And the first thing that they try to do is they try to discredit the guy who, I'm sorry, somebody pointed out that I misspoke. It was indeed the Washington Post and not the New York Times that published the Pentagon Papers. I'm sorry about that. Misspeak there. I'm pretty sure. No, New York Times. New York Times did it. Washington Post is going to be later when it gets into the Watergate stuff. It is the New York Times. I just checked my notes. All right. So the first thing they do is they try to discredit the guy who leaked the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg. So they go to his psychiatrist's office and they break into the files and they steal the notes from his psychiatrist's office. And again, this is one of the things that political historians do, is we look at little things like that. And, you know, realistically, across the America today, and I'm making this up, but realistically, there's probably somebody's psychiatrist's office being broken into right now. Or some medical records being compromised. And for the vast majority of those things, it is not of national note. No one, it doesn't matter if my neighbor's medical records go online or whatever. I mean, ethically it matters and all that sort of thing. But in terms of the national government, if my next door neighbor has a hernia, it doesn't matter to the world. This little burglary in this psychiatrist's office with the loss of this file obviously mattered, because it was an attempt to discredit this guy who had released these papers. All right, so that is weird, but you know, it's still just weird, right? Like, it's just weird. All right, so then, I mean, you're watching this and you're thinking, who cares? Psychiatrist's office, we don't really understand psychiatry yet in the way we should, you know, so who cares? But then it turns out by 1972, out of the White House is operating what is essentially a shadow government. And it's called the Committee to Re-elect the President, which I love because its acronym is CREEP, the C-R-E-E-P, CREEP. Becomes that known as that when what it's doing comes out. And what's really interesting about this is that it is a group that is designed to destroy Nixon's opponents. And what they're doing is called, they call themselves this, is called rat expletive. That's where that word comes from. They are rat the Democrats. And what they're doing is they are planting fake letters in newspapers. They're hiring vendors for Democratic rallies. And then when the people show up and bring all their catering and all that, the Democrats haven't done it, they won't pay the bills, so that pisses off people at the Democrats. They plant spies in the Democratic camps. They do all kinds of stuff that you're going to see now on steroids. This is almost the beginning of the psyops things we see going on now in political events. I'm sorry, in politics. The idea that you're going to change somebody's opinions by throwing letters at the letters to the editor in newspapers, for example, that are handwritten. Now, if you actually study this stuff, you know you could actually, I can't believe I'm saying this to you guys, but you could actually go hire what's called a public relations campaign and get people to do this for you. And this is what troll farms do. They go to message boards. There's probably some on here now. They go to message boards and they throw crap at it so that if you're the person sitting there going, and I really don't like the defunding of the United States Postal Service, and you get 25 people going, man, you're a moron, you start to go, oh, wait, maybe I've got the wrong position. That all started here in 72. I mean, not started, we've had it in American history all along, but in a concerted way by a political campaign, it begins in 1972. So what happens is finally they're so desperate that on June 17th, 1972, they try to wiretap the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in Washington's famous hotel, the Watergate. And the Watergate security guard noticed that doors were wedged open. They called the police, and the police arrest 5 men who are trying to take photographs in the office and trying to bug the office. Immediately, the White House said it had no knowledge of it and called it a third-rate burglary attempt. And most of the press said, okay, fine, we're good. But there's where the Washington Post comes in. There's 2 new reporters for the, I'm sorry, I'm all excited by this. I've lost sort of track of the Republican Party. But at this point, I'm going to go ahead and finish Nixon because it's just fascinating. Give me the leeway to do this. I've been working so freaking hard on my courses, and this stuff is so much more fun than filling out paperwork. I'm sorry if I'm boring you, but let me just finish Nixon, and then I promise I'll get back on track next week. Actually, I just saw somebody posted that Forrest Gump saw this. I will point out, if you have not seen the movie, I think it's called Bob, where I think it's Reese Witherspoon is, it's kind of a kid, a spoof on all this. I thought it was hilariously funny. And I'm not going to tell you the best scene, but when the 18 minutes disappear, it's worth seeing the movie. Anyway, somebody might remember what I'm talking about, and I don't actually remember. I think it's called Bob. Anyway, so what happens is the Washington Post has these two new, which is run by Katharine Graham at the time, who wrote her own biography, which won a Pulitzer, I believe. These two guys, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, were reporters. And young reporters tend to be hungry, first of all, but they also were the people who were in charge of sort of watching the little piddly stuff that was happening in the courts in Washington, D.C. And it turned out that the burglars had a money trail. They left a money trail, and the money trail was really interesting. So like the bills that they were carrying on them actually had consecutive serial numbers. Well, that means they came right from the mint, right? Or right from something. This is days before ATMs, by the way. So they came directly from somewhere. And one of them actually had a little black book, if you will. And in it, it actually had a name, and his address was WH, which pretty much looked like White House, right? So when that happens, they keep talking about this, and Nixon starts to blame what they are saying on the liberal bias of the media. They're not giving him a fair shake. You're also going to get the attacks on the media coming from Nixon. This obviously gains no traction at all before the election. This is June of 72, June 17th of 1972. And it gains no traction at all. And Nixon and his vice president, Spiro Agnew, former governor of Maryland, win with more than 60% of the vote. This is a blowout. So the fact that Nixon felt so insecure he had to pull all this crap says so much about his mental capacity. And there's a wonderful book by, I believe it's by Richard Rovere, who was a writer for The New Yorker, on what the presidency did to Nixon's mind. And it's really, anything that Revere does was interesting, but this was especially interesting. Anyway, so they took 520 electoral votes. They took the electoral votes of 49 states. The Democratic nominees, which is Senator George McGovern, who had a PhD in American history, I will have to tell you, a very bright man. And his vice presidential candidate, Sargent Shriver, only got about 37.5% of the voters, and only got the electoral votes of the District of Columbia and of Massachusetts, which is where we're going to get the bumper stickers that say, "Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts." All right, but here's a problem. A lot of people who supported Nixon fervently in 72, because it's us versus them, right? When they realized that he had lied to him, they turned on him with the fury of betrayal. And that's one of the things that's really interesting in politics. And you see it right now with people who had been Trump supporters and have turned against Trump. In a way, somebody who has converted is much more virulent than somebody who was anti all along. So you see this, I say, with the people who have turned against Trump now. Boy, are they mad, and because they were duped. And the same is true with the people who turn against Nixon. What happens is in March of 1973, when those burglars go to be sentenced for their burglary, one of the burglars admits that he and one of his co-defendants have perjured themselves to protect their employers. As soon as that happened, the White House counsel, the person who defends the office of the presidency, named John Dean, he turns state's evidence and he starts to talk. In April, 3 of Nixon's top advisors resign, and the president has to appoint a special counsel, a guy named Archibald Cox, as a special prosecutor to investigate Watergate, the Watergate affair. And the following month, the Senate begins nationally televised hearings and to see what happened in this scandal. And this just falls apart really quickly. It turns out that as this heats up, as they look into the past, they discover that Spiro Agnew has cheated on his taxes, so he's got to resign, and he was Mr. Law and Order. And it turns out he's nothing but a tax cheat. He pleads guilty of tax evasion, so he doesn't go to jail. This is how we get Gerald Ford as vice president. He's nominated, he's put on the ticket under the 25th Amendment, first time it's used. And he resigns Spiro Agnew resigns from the office in 1973. Tidbit here, he's only the second vice president, to resign. John C. Calhoun had resigned in 1832 because he couldn't stand Andrew Jackson. That's the only other time it had happened. Meanwhile, the Senate hearings had uncovered that there were actually audio tapes of what had happened in the Oval Office. Really interesting moment when I believe they're interviewing a guy named Butterfield, and he's really specific about what happened on a certain day, and everybody's bored and nothing's getting anywhere. And they're like, "How are you so clear about what happened?" He's like, "Well, I just listened to the tapes." And they're like, "The tapes?" And that's how they found out that there were going to be audio tapes of all this. When that happens, Cox subpoenas a bunch of the tapes. When Cox subpoenas the tapes, Nixon fires him. And when he wants to fire him, Nixon goes to his attorney general, a guy named Elliot Richardson, and tells him to fire Archibald Cox. Elliot Richardson says, "That ain't happening." He resigns in protest. When he resigns in protest, the next guy down, the deputy attorney general, William Ruckelshaus, should have given the information to Cox that he was fired. He resigned. He refused to as well. So it went to the third guy down to tell Cox that he was being fired. And that guy was Robert Bork. That's why Robert Bork gets bona fides with the movement conservatives, because he's the guy willing to carry out the Saturday Night Massacre. That's what's all going on there. All right. When this happens, people are furious. And this forces Nixon to go on TV and say, "I am not a crook." And he has to appoint a new special prosecutor, and that's Leon Jaworski. And Leon Jaworski goes ahead and fights for access to the tapes. And finally, the Supreme Court sides unanimously with Jaworski, and Nixon has to release transcripts of the tapes, not the tapes themselves, but they themselves are damning, less because of the very long, boring nature of them, but because Nixon had always cultivated an image of being like this clean family man. And the tapes are full of expletive deleted. So it makes him sound absolutely foul-mouthed. He's a Quaker. The expletives are mostly the word D-A-M-N, but in people's minds, it was other four-letter words than that. And that's when we got that whole expletive deleted thing in the 70s, the t-shirts that said expletive deleted. The House of Representatives goes ahead and begins to develop articles of impeachment. They pass through the House Judiciary Committee. It's clear that the House is going to adopt them. And when that happens, Nixon continues to insist that he is not guilty, that this is a liberal plot against him. This is the thems coming for the us's. And when that happens, yet another tape comes out that makes it very clear that he and an aide were plotting to cover up what had happened on June 17th at the Watergate. And when that happens, and then there's also a missing 18 and a half minutes of tapes that his secretary, Rosemary Woods, tries to take credit for. But if you look at the position in which she had to be sitting in order to erase those tapes, it's pretty clearly something was bad on those tapes, which, by the way, I'm going to throw this out here to you digital people. With all our technologies now to recover things, I would guess somebody could probably find out what was on those tapes now. And I wish I had the skill to go do it, but I'm putting a bug in someone's ear there. Anyway, it's pretty clear that the gig is up, that Nixon has been caught red-handed. And at that point, even though the House has not voted on the articles of impeachment yet, it's clear the House is going to pass them, and senators recognize that the senators, including the Republican senators, have lost faith in Nixon, and that they are going to vote to convict him. And this is something that came up again during Donald Trump's impeachment trial in the Senate, that the senators for the Republican Party simply said, yeah, he's guilty, but we don't care, because we care more about having him in office than we care about the law. And a lot of people jumped on that and said, you know, you cared in the 1970s, in 1974. What's wrong with you people? But what happens then is that a group of senators led by Barry Goldwater of Arizona go to Nixon and they say, dude, it's time. You need to resign the office of the presidency. And on August 9th, 1974, Nixon became the first president of the United States to resign his office. And yet, He never accepts any responsibility for what has happened. He continues to maintain his innocence for the rest of his life. In his memoirs, he insists that he did nothing wrong, but that he was hounded out of office by the liberal media, and that made it impossible for him to do his job. And as you may remember, he later tells David Frost, a TV interviewer, that he did nothing illegal because when the president does it, you see, David, that means it's not illegal. And you see that, of course, coming up again with the Trump administration. So I here have spent way too much time on Nixon, but he's such a seminal figure, and I will pick up Reagan. But let me just tell you how Nixon ties into the larger story of the Republican Party. And that is that he is clearly a huge transitional figure. Because with Nixon, you get the movement conservative language and principles into the Republican Party as a mainstay of it. Like Nixon, when he was elected in '68, used the movement conservatives, really especially the Dixiecrats, coming from the Democratic Party, to get himself into office. But from '68 to '70, he really did try to sort of give to the traditional Republicans who belong to the liberal consensus, as well as the movement conservatives. He's always trying to make this coalition work. After 1970, after the bombing of Cambodia, after Kent State, he really goes all in for movement conservatism. He begins to divide the country rhetorically, saying there's us good guys, the hardworking white men who are paying taxes, against them, people of color, women who want equality of opportunity. And that includes the right to reproductive choice. He begins really to explicitly divide the country into between us and them, a rhetorical device that the movement conservatives are going to use enormously effectively for the rest of American history up to the present. And what he does is he brings that movement conservatism into the Republican Party, and he's a transitional figure from the traditional republicanism, liberal consensus republicanism of the Eisenhower years, for whom he was a vice president, into the post-Nixon Republican Party, which is going to be characterized, I'm afraid, next week by Reagan, who is going to pick up Nixon's language, but also pick up not only the language of movement conservatism, but also the principles of movement conservatism in a way that Nixon really did not. So I'm sorry not to have given you what I promised, which was a trip into Reagan, and to have gotten so sidetracked in Nixon, but I hope you found that interesting. I certainly enjoyed the break from doing paperwork, and I appreciate that you were here once again. This is a trip through the Republican Party by me, a historian of the Republican Party. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I am a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these talks. This is the Thursday 1 o'clock history chat. I do Tuesday 4 o'clock history and politics, and of course the nightly letter. Thank you all for being here, and I'm a little embarrassed I got so carried away by Nixon, to be honest, but I hope it was interesting, and I will see you next week, having now stretched this out a little bit longer than I expected to, with Reagan. I expect that after Reagan, I'll have only 1 week, maybe 2 weeks left of the Republican Party, and then perhaps we'll turn to something else. Thanks a lot for being here, and I will see you next week.